Today's presentation is about a paradigm shift, and I'm not one to often use that term, but I think it's extremely important to drive home some points about what's happened to network security technology just in the last couple of years. So I'm going to be reviewing a lot of history, both of the threats and of the technology. But first let me start out by describing what is actually, in my mind, a double paradigm shift. So there are two important changes occurring at the same time. And the one that most of us are most familiar with, since every vendor in the world keeps hitting us over the head with it, is that the old threats of things like viruses, worms, or to quote a relatively famous Gartner analyst, pimply-faced Canadian teenagers, which refers, of course, to a famous malware attack, to the new threats, which are financially motivated. They include spyware, malicious URLs with drive-by downloads on them, the Russian mafia, and the Chinese Red Army. There's a big difference in what we have to battle today as compared to what we battled when most of us got into IT security, which was pretty much business as usual, new malware of the day, how to counter it, to today where there's a new attacker of the day and how to counter that attacker. At the same time, the old technology that used to counter those problems, viruses, worms, which was pretty much stateful inspection firewalls and IDS, were the only tools available to us for the longest time, is giving way to the new technology. Content inspection firewalls, anti-spyware, URL filtering to block those malicious sites, and then the continuous real-time research that's required in order to stay on top of that. I was talking to a spyware researcher the other day, and he said there are 32,000 new pieces of spyware that they have to write signatures for every day. Now, how do you do that? It's not easy. You have to write methods instead of just pure signatures for every single one of them. And luckily, they do fall into classes and families. Let's talk about those old threats, just to refresh the sorts of things that most of us were fighting in the 80s and 90s. As a matter of fact, we're coming up, or we're very close to, I think it's the close to the 20th anniversary of the Morris worm attack. So Morris worm was released on the then ARPANET, which connected a bunch of universities together. And Morris was actually the son of a researcher at a US institution. And that researcher had published a paper saying it would be possible to write software that was self-replicating. And his son demonstrated to him that, yep, Dad, it is possible, and his son had to do jail time for it. Code Red, I think, pretty much kicks off the new era of attacks and worms. Code Red was released on the internet May 1st of 2001. And he used a vulnerability that had been existent in Microsoft IIS server for close to a year before that. So most IIS servers, Microsoft's web server product out there, were actually vulnerable to this attack. There had been the famous Chinese hacker attacks that used that vulnerability to take over many US-based government installations. And then luckily somebody wrote a worm to take down all of the internet information servers from Microsoft, and that kind of forced us to the new era of patching. There's so many security, and as a matter of fact, I was one of them. I was one of the security analysts out there saying, hey, patch your systems, do it now or you'll be very, very sorry. And it took Code Red to demonstrate to everybody that that was what was required. But it wasn't quite enough, because Nimda, which was released on the internet on November, let me do the math, let's see, September 11 plus 7, September 18th, 2001. It was actually released within 15 minutes and a week of the first airplane flying into the World Trade Center in New York City on 9/11. Nimda was a multi-headed worm. It used the same vulnerabilities that Code Red did and spread the same way, but that was only one of its heads. It would also spread via email. Once somebody had browsed to a web server that was infected with Nimda, they would get infected with the client version of Nimda. That would, of course, use their email to spread via email and file shares internally. And then finally, it would also use a backdoor that was left behind by Code Red. So even patched systems that hadn't been completely rebuilt were still vulnerable to attack. There was a slight hiatus until the next big attack, SQL Slammer. You may recall, January 25th of 2003. SQL Slammer arguably was one of the most devastating worms ever released on the internet. Its effect, I mean, all it did was spread. It was a UDP-based worm, so a single packet, if received by a Microsoft SQL server, would get infected, and then it would start to spew out packets trying to find other SQL servers around the internet to infect. It infected 80,000 machines in a period of minutes. It was released East Coast time on January 25th, which was a Friday evening, and pretty much brought the internet to its knees. Bandwidth utilization doubled on the backbones, went from 5 to 10 gigs. And for a while there, the carriers could not even get to their routers to start filtering the high-level ports that SQL Slammer spread over, which was ports 1386. And lessons learned from that was, hey, block high-level ports. Most organizations realize that there's no reason at all that their firewall should be configured to allow SQL requests over the internet. And since then, they started blocking ports. So that was great. So now we got lesson number 1, patch your servers. Lesson number 2, block high-level ports. And then along comes MS Blaster, which was a RPC DCOM based exploit. And MS Blaster was pretty effectively stopped by most enterprise firewalls because it was transmitted over a higher level port, like port 445, and most people were ready for it. Most servers were patched, so weren't infected, but desktop and laptop machines were not ready for MS Blaster. They got infected, and people brought their laptops into the corporate environment and infected the corporate environment that way. And of course, we know what happened then. Cisco went off on its hey, we can't protect the network, so now we're going to make sure that only clean machines are allowed on our network, because we're going to throw up our hands and give up on the network security side. And my anti-NAC feelings are coming through here. So those are the old threats. Remember the old internet, cool site of the day? I was working at a little company that published some really cool Java stuff on their webpage. It became cool site of the day, and they got 100,000 hits that day. Ooh. If you get Dig today, if you're on the front page of Dig or Reddit, one of the social bookmarking sites, you get 100,000 hits. I've done that several times just with my blog. Or Britannica going online and charging for access to it. Or for me, personally, I was a mechanical engineer in the early days of the internet, and General Electric posted their complete set of data sheets for all of the plastics that they manufactured. That was quite helpful. That was like the first time I said, wow, we can get information off of the internet.